everybody. So last week we talked about David. He wasn't the king yet, and we talked about how the king's son Jonathan warned David that he needed to run away because King Saul was definitely trying to kill David. So what did David do? Well, the first thing he did was he went running towards the temple. Now, remember, David he couldn't just go home. His wife was the daughter of the king, and I'm sure that there was guards there. And so he needed to think of a relatively safe place where he could go and get some food and a weapon. He didn't even have those things. So he went running to the temple. Because he loved God, the temple probably felt like home. It probably felt like a safe place for him to run. So that's where he went, and he met with the high priest. Now the high priest's name was Ahimelech, and Ahimelech saw him coming, and he was actually frightened because, remember, David was very, very high in Saul's army, and Ahimelech couldn't figure out why he was there all by himself. So at first he was frightened, but David calmed his fears and said, no, shh, I'm on a secret mission for the king, but I had to leave so quickly that I don't have any food. Could I have some food, please? Well, Ahimelech didn't have any food at that time. He didn't have any bread to give David, and so he gave him some of the showbread in the temple. Remember, there was 12 flat loaves of bread to represent the 12 tribes of Israel in the tabernacle. And so he gave that to David to eat. And then David said, "Do you have a weapon? I don't even have my sword." So Ahimelech said, "Well, we don't have anything here except for the sword of Goliath that you used." And so David was like, "That'll do great. Just give that to me and I'll be on my way." Well, there was one problem with all of this. There was a man there that day. We don't know why, because he wasn't an Israelite. His name was Doeg, and he was Saul's herdsman, the top herdsman. He took care of Saul's probably cows or something like that. And he heard this conversation, and he stored that away for future use. And David knew this might be a problem, but he was desperate. So after he got the bread and the sword, David kept on going. I'm going to put this here because there's some details I need to try and remember. Okay, so after there, David was so frightened of Saul that he ran away to the Philistine land. Remember, the Philistines were the enemies of Israel, and he figured, well, Saul won't look for me in Philistine land. So he went in there. Unfortunately, they recognized him right away. They knew who he was, and they took him to King Achish in Gath. And David was so afraid of the Philistine king. I mean, remember, David had conquered Goliath and fought many battles against the Philistines. So David was so frightened that he pretended he was crazy, and he started acting really like someone who had lost his marbles. And so the king was like, "What did you bring a crazy man to my palace for? Get rid of him." So they kicked him out, and he went back to Israel because he thought, "Oh, it is not safe for me here. Everyone knows who I am." So instead, he went to the wilderness where there was caves and there weren't people living there, where he could hide. Well, there's not secrets for long, and so many people heard through the grapevine that David was hiding in the wilderness, and all the people who were dissatisfied with Saul and with the way things were going in their lives, they decided that they would follow David. And even David's own brothers decided that they would come and see him in the wilderness. And so after a while, there was actually 600 men who came to the wilderness to be with David in the wilderness. Well, of course, King Saul heard all of this too, so he decided to go and try and find him. And it was like a game of hide and seek in the wilderness. There was rocks and caves and hills and mountains, and they would go follow, Saul would follow David all around these different places trying to find him. Well, Saul was unsuccessful. And one day, as Saul was sitting with his trusted group of men that he had banded together to go and catch David, he was very angry. The jealousy was just eating him up inside. And he was so mad that he couldn't find David. And he was yelling at his men saying, "You guys aren't even loyal to me. You didn't even tell me my own son was in league with David. And how can I trust any of you?" And Doeg was there that day. And he loved to try to find ways to win favor with those in authority, to get one up on others and things. And so he said, "Ooh, I know something that you don't know. Let me just tell you about it." And so he told King Saul about seeing David in the tabernacle with the high priest. Well, King Saul was furious. And he demanded that they go get the high priest and some of his sons, and they brought them. And Saul demanded of Ahimelech, "Why did you help my enemy David?" And Ahimelech was so confused. I mean, as far as he knew, David had killed Goliath and rescued Israel from the Philistines. And David was captain in the army, and he had fought the Philistines, and he was top man in Saul's military force and things like that. And he said, "Oh, king, who of all your servants is as loyal as David is? He's your own son-in-law. He married your daughter. He's the captain of your guards. He's highly respected in your household throughout the land. Please don't be upset with me. I didn't know about any disagreement between you and David. Why would there even be one? That doesn't even make sense." Well, Saul was in such a rage he wouldn't even listen to Ahimelech. He had a real anger problem, and he ordered his soldiers to kill the high priest and his entire family. And there was a lot of people there. There was a very large number of people. The high priest, all his sons were priests, and then there was their wives and their children, their entire families. And the soldiers refused to obey Saul. They said, "How can we raise our hand against the priest of the God in heaven? We can't." But remember, Doeg was not an Israelite. He didn't worship God. So Saul turned to him and said, "You kill them." And Doeg, who was always happy to win favor, went ahead and did what Saul had asked. And sadly, Ahimelech and his entire family were killed by Doeg because of Saul's bad temper and jealousy of David. Absolutely illogical, but that's the way it was. So, now Ahimelech had one son named Abiathar, and he was the only one in the entire family who escaped from Doeg, and he ran to David. And he told David what had happened. And David felt so terrible. He felt like it was his fault because he had gone to Ahimelech to ask for help, and he had seen Doeg there, and he was afraid that something bad might happen. So he said to Abiathar, he said, "If you stay with me, I will guard you with my life." And so Abiathar did stay with him. And eventually he became the high priest years later. Well, poor David, he was running and running from King Saul. Now, up to this point in his life, you may remember that he was the youngest son in his family, but he was from a good family. He came from the line of Obed and remember Ruth and Boaz, and his father was Jesse, and he had been a shepherd. He wasn't a slave or anything like that. He wasn't from the lower classes. He had worked for the king playing musical instruments. He had, with God's help, defeated Goliath. He had married the king's daughter. So he had had great success through God's help. And he had faced testing, but this was a whole new level of testing. Now, when we go through difficult times in life like David did, running away from Saul, fearing for his life every day, he may have felt as though God had deserted him. Like, you anointed me the king, but now I'm in danger of my life every day. What happened with that? Like, what's going on? I don't understand. Did I make a mistake? What's going to happen? But I'm sure God knew that David needed this time to learn a whole new level of maturity and a whole new kind of faith in God through hopeless times. And even though it may have seemed at times as though God was not with him, we know as we read through this section of the Bible that God was definitely with him. He guided him. He protected him in many ways. So it was a time of growth and learning for David as he worshiped God in a new way and learned new things that he would need to know in order to reach a new depth of maturity and faith in God. So during his time hiding in the caves and running from Saul, he wrote many psalms that are in the Bible that we can read and be blessed by when we go through bad times, and even some prophecy referring to Jesus, because Jesus himself was like David. He didn't have a home to go home to bed to and have warm meals cooked for him. It says that he didn't have a place to lay his head in the New Testament, and he had many trials, and he was betrayed, and he was hated by many people himself. And so there is a connection there between David at this point in his life and Jesus in the New Testament later. So one thing that happened during all of this was that there was a city called Keilah that was near the Philistine border, and the Philistines were coming stealing their food just at the time when there was harvest. And David heard about this, and it really bothered him. He cared about his land and his people and what was happening to them, and so he asked God if he should go and help them, and God said yes. And then David wasn't really sure, so he prayed again and asked if he should go to Keilah and help them, and God said, yes, go, help them, I'll be with you. And so David and his 600 men went to Keilah, and they defeated the Philistines and protected the city of Keilah and their food. Well, things don't always go the way you might expect. It was a walled city, and Saul heard about this, and he decided this was the perfect opportunity to catch David and inside this walled city. So he left with troops to go and catch him at Keilah. Well, the grapevine must have been working really good back then, and David heard he was coming, and he prayed and asked God if the people in Keilah would deliver him up to Saul or whether he should leave. And God told David that if he stayed in the city, the people really would deliver him up to Saul, even though he had just rescued them. And so David and his men went away and went to hide again. At one point in David's hiding in the wilderness, Jonathan, remember his friend, the son of King Saul, came to visit him, and they had a visit out in the wilderness. And Jonathan said again, I know God has chosen you. Please remember my family when you become the king, because I know you will be. And they encouraged each other, and Jonathan went away. That was the last time they would see each other. And Saul continued to chase David. He was not giving up. He was full of anger. Well, at one point, well, not just at one point, it happened a few times. There's always people who want to garner favor with those who are in authority, and they will do anything at all to get the favor of those in authority so that they can get stuff from them and raise higher in position. And so people were always bringing tales to Saul of where David was. And so at one point, Saul almost caught him. He was on one side of the mountain with a whole bunch of men, and David and his men were on the other side of the mountain, very, very close. And at the last minute, news came to Saul the Philistines had invaded the land, and Saul and his army had to leave. And so David was safe. Another time, Saul came with many men to try to find David. He had a pretty good idea of where he was. And David and his men were hiding in a very, very large cave. It must have been very large because remember, he had many men with him. And Saul was tired, and so he went in the cave and went to sleep. And David was there with his men, and his men were like, "This is your chance. God has delivered Saul into your hands. Now it's up to you. You can take what's rightfully yours. You've been anointed the king. All you have to do is kill Saul, and you will be the next king." And David wouldn't do it. He said, "How can I raise my hand against the Lord's anointed?" Remember, Saul had been anointed too, and David was not willing to take something that was still belonging to someone else, even though he knew eventually it would be given to him. He wanted to wait for God to have his complete will done. And so he didn't kill Saul, but he did sneak up as Saul was sleeping, and he cut off a little piece of the hem of Saul's robe. And when Saul went out after he woke up, David waited for him to get down the hill, and then he came out of the cave and he was like, "Oh, Saul, look what I've got." And he yelled at him, and he was waving the piece of cloth that he had cut off from Saul's robe. And he said, "Look, I have a piece of your robe. I could have killed you. I know you came here to kill me, but I did not do it. You think I'm your enemy, but I think this proves that I am not your enemy." And he said, "Let God judge between you and me, who is doing right. I could have killed you, but I didn't. But you would have killed me." And Saul, he was stricken. His conscience actually managed to break through all that jealousy and anger, and it smote him, and he realized, and he said, "You are righteous, David. I am the unrighteous one. I am so sorry. I will leave and I won't pursue anymore." And he did leave, and he went back to his palace. But David knew that Saul could not be trusted, that his jealousy and anger were just overwhelming. And so David and his men just went to a new place to hide because they knew that it was not over yet. Now, all of us at some point in our lives, some more than others, will have people that despise us, that are jealous or just hateful, and they will try to hurt you. Well, David can show us what to do in that situation. If we are God's child, then he can protect us, and we can put our faith in him. And we don't need to have revenge on anyone. That would make us like Saul. But if we trust in God, we can trust him to take care of the situation. And like David said, we can say, God, you judge between them and us, and your will be done. And that can be difficult at times, but we need to remember that that is what God wants us to do. We also are sinners, and we can sometimes unintentionally hurt others, and we need to remember what God would want us to do in the situation like David had, with Saul chasing him and wanting to kill him for no reason other than jealousy. So remember that when times are tough, like David was in here, that we can trust in God. And also remember that we can trust in him when we have people in our lives that are trying to hurt us. So next week we will find out more of what happened to David. Okay, thanks, bye.